This is Garis book readings of my 2 published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is Chapter 8, Part 3 of my second book, entitled Multis and Monos, What the Multicultured Can Teach the Monocultured Towards the Creation of a Global State. This is Part 3, continuing straight on. J. Hybrid Approaches Route. In practice, probably all of the above routes will be taken simultaneously. The world is a complex place, with billions of people all interacting with each other in a political arena of some 200 countries, with many thousands of cities and political regions. No one human mind can possibly comprehend the complexities of all the political/ideological interactions going on at all kinds of levels all over the planet. Despite the complexity, it's still possible that all these various social/political/technological etc. forces are pushing in more or less the same general direction. That is, towards a more integrated and unified world, where communications between all parts of the world improve, where ideas travel quickly all over the planet, where all the world is exposed to the ideas of all the world, so that a competition between ideas takes place in a global arena in which only the most popular ideas survive. As globist political parties try to cope with the complexities, they can be guided by the big picture that I have tried to paint in this book. That is, ideas such as the need for global cultural homogenization, for a global language, a global media, a globist ideology, globist political parties, etc. The creation of such institutions will help the globist cause immensely. The globists will be able to take advantage of synergistic effects, that is, mutually reinforcing influences. For example, spreadsheets help the sales of personal computers, PCs, and PCs help the sale of spreadsheets. The efforts of the globists to spread globist ideology will create more interest in the concept. For example, the more the global language is spoken, the better the globists can spread their ideology. With a global media that the globists can help install, the globe becomes more aware of a global consciousness, a global cultural homogenization, and hence will grow an awareness of the possibility of the creation of a global state with all its enormous benefits. K. Globist ideology. The whole process of creating a global state will be fostered and energized by the existence of an appropriate ideology. Once billions of people believe that the time is ripe for the creation of a global state, that it will happen. But how does one persuade billions of people to shift their loyalties away from nation states towards a global state? Here is where a globist ideology will play its fundamental role. One of my main aims in writing this book is to make a contribution towards this magnificent goal by providing new concepts, new ideas, and particularly new labels to promote the idea of creating a global state. Generally speaking, social, political movements usually start with a tiny minority of people, that is, the intellectual thinkers, that is, the sages, who put their isolated ideas into books and articles. It's often the case that their ideas are completely ignored at first due to their unfamiliarity, or are opposed due to their differences with customary ways of doing things or ways of thinking. However, in time, their ideas begin to penetrate, and then as the second stage, the journalists usually pick up the new ways of thinking or new ideas and write articles about them in the popular media, so that millions, even billions of people begin to be exposed to the new ideas. Journalists are always hungry for a good new theme to write about, but the theme has to be comprehensible to their readers. Thus, utterly new ideas are not written about by the journalists if they feel that their readers won't have a clue what they're writing about. Hence, new ideas need time to penetrate the minds of the journalists before they pass on the ideas of the intellectuals to the public. Once that happens, a third phase can begin, namely public acceptance of the ideas and their implementation via the democratic process into legislative and institutional change. This three-step process cannot begin unless step one is well launched. For that to happen, the intellectuals, that is the sages, need to create the ideas and present them in a coherent manner to the readers of their books and to the journalists. Usually, the readers of books and the journalists are the same people, but not always. Only half the population reads even one book a year. Most people are influenced in their ideas by what they see on the mass media, particularly on television and increasingly the internet. The political movement in favour of creating a global state needs its marks, or several of them, to present a clear, compelling and motivating ideology. When I went to the internet to buy books on the idea of building a global state, I was surprised how few of them there are. I interpret this to mean that the idea is still not widespread, although it was much better known in the late 1940s, as shown in Chapter 1. Hence more books need to be written by intellectuals, sages, to other intellectuals, so that a critical mass of books and technical articles can be generated to get the concept fully launched, actually relaunched, rather than it remaining with its current status as a fringe interest. An ideology is a set of ideas and concepts that aim towards the attainment of some desired goal. In this case, it's the creation of a global state. The ideology needs to persuade people that creating a global state would be a good thing, and even better, that it is virtually inevitable. Imagine the rise of socialism without its ideology, its concepts, and particularly its label. How would you label socialist ideas without the word socialist? You would have to invent a word to perform that task. But a label is only useful if it's a label of something, in this case, ideas. The three letters ism, ISM, in the word globism imply that we are labeling an ideology, that is, a set of ideas that favour the creation of a global state. The term globist, that is, a proponent of globism, is presumably someone who has globist ideas, but that implies that those ideas already exist. Until the ideas exist that come into being, there'll be no globists. It's the job of the intellectuals, sages, to create the ideas. That's their role in society. They are the idea mongers, the opinion creators. They are the real movers of society, because they infiltrate the minds of billions of people, teaching them what is worthwhile to do. Look at the huge historical impact of political philosophers such as Locke, Rousseau, and Marx. Their ideas transformed not just countries, but the whole planet. There was a time not long ago when half the world's population was under communist control, and most of the other half under democratic control. Ideas are important. We are slaves to ideas. They dominate our minds, consciously and mostly unconsciously. This book aims to help create a globist ideology. It has presented a history of the globist cause in Chapter 1, Section E. It has presented the main ideas of a global state in the early chapters, and presents in this chapter ideas on how a global state might be formed. In Chapter 7, it discussed the many forces that will oppose its creation. In Chapter 9, it will present ideas on what a global state could do for the world. This book tries to lay the groundwork for the creation of this ideology, so that the label globism actually refers to something. Once globist ideas are fairly well established, once the intellectuals, sages, have discussed and criticized them amongst themselves so that their inconsistencies and unrealistic aspects have been removed, then the journalistic and popular phases of the ideological spread can begin. Once millions of people have been exposed to the ideas of the globists, the next stage will be organizational and political. University academics will climb onto the bandwagon and write technical and detailed articles about the topic, discussing its finer points. Interest groups will be formed, and politicians will be influenced. Just how might all this play itself out in more concrete terms? The above paragraphs are rather general and abstract. What is now needed is more concrete advice that budding globist activists could follow. What could they do, in more practical terms, to promote the creation of a global state? As stated at the beginning of this section, it's obvious that if a global state is to be established, large numbers of people will be needed to make it happen. At the time of writing, there are very few globists in the world, so obviously a much greater number will need to be created. One of the first requirements of the globists, therefore, will be to increase their numbers, and this implies educating many people to adopt a globist philosophy, or globist ideology. Any new political or religious movement that aspires to change the world is faced with the same education problem. That is, how to persuade large numbers of people around the world to become adherents of the new ideology. For example, look at new religious sects, new political parties. Look, for example, at the methods used by the Italian fascists, the German Nazis, the Russian Bolsheviks, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, etc. Each of these ideological or religious groups had their own symbols, their slogans, their chants, their songs, their flags, their banners, their pamphlets, their magazines, their radio and later TV programs, their speakers, their ideologues, their sacred texts, etc. The globalists will be no different. They will need all the means that they can find to spread their message. As usual, any such movement usually begins with a few intellectuals crying in the wilderness. But there are already a growing number of them, including myself. By Googling the term globist or globism, one can even find, at the time of writing, that was 2007, these terms and even a suggested globist flag. For example, a blue-filled circle with a white background, similar to the Japanese flag, which has a red circle. So the first time in the creation of a globist ideology, the first step in the creation of a globist ideology is for the intellectuals to create the ideas, to write the books, and lay out a strategy for a globist political movement. That is why I'm hoping to contribute towards in this book. I believe there are so many social, political, economic, technological and philosophical forces this century pushing towards the creation of a global state that it's virtually inevitable. It's only a question of time before a sufficient number of intellectuals will have created enough books on the topic that a social movement can grow from them. The ideas in the ideology will have been born. Actually, in light of the history of the idea of a global state, as presented in Chapter 1, Section E, we should really be talking more about a revival of the idea. The next step will be to get the journalists interested and to set up internet interest groups. Journalists have incredible power. They can influence the minds of millions of people at a time by publishing their articles or presenting their points on television or radio. Since journalists are always hungry for a story, the globalists need only write their books and then approach the journalists. The journalists will then educate the masses using the mass media. With the internet, the journalists are less needed. Individuals can create their own interest groups on the web and build up their numbers that way. They can help stimulate large numbers of people to read the books of the early ideologists, as well as provide short, easy-to-read summaries of the main ideas. Any such movement needs its leaders, both of the theoretical ideological kind and of the political activist kind, that is, both of the Marx and of the Lenin kind. Once the ideology is clear and the movement has found its legs to stand on, the next step is to go public in a much bigger way, to become a mass movement. What would be needed at this stage is public visibility, to become noticed. One could imagine, for example, that globalists around the world might, whenever they're at a meeting in a country which is nationalistic enough to play the national anthem, that they sneer, heckle or boo, or sing some globist anthem instead, generally making the point to the nationalists singing the national anthem that perhaps they would be better advised to be singing a globist anthem instead. When the media starts picking up on such events, that would be the cue for the globalists to start making the claim that the world would be better off living in a global state, and that it's not a long-term pipe dream given the powerful forces making it happen this century. With enough globalists constantly deriding the nationalist feelings, people will start wondering what the globalists are talking about and get curious, thus exposing themselves to globist intellectual and ideological influences. In time, the number of globalists will grow and grow. Once the number of globalists is sufficiently large, globist political parties could be formed in the more advanced, richer, democratic countries, and thanks to the internet, they could link up easily, swapping ideas and experiences. This will be harder to do in dictatorships which use internet censoring software, as in China, the shithole. But there are always software tricks one can use to help get round such restrictions, such as VPNs, virtual private networks, which I use constantly and have done for the whole time I've been living in China, which is now 11 years at the time of reading this aloud. The globist parties of many countries can exchange ideas and come to a global consensus on strategy and ideology. They can help foster technologies that increase the probability of the creation of a global state. For example, cheap, tiny TV receivers that can be smuggled easily into dictatorial countries that can receive TV broadcasts from the satellites of other countries. Imagine, for example, if the majority of citizens of North Korea could see how most of the rich democratic countries live. It would be a great shock to them, motivating them to be able to live like people in the rich democracies as well. Once globist parties are strong in their respective countries, they could combine to form a global globist party and come to a common strategy. This global party can then push individual countries into ceding more national sovereignty by joining political unions and in time a mini Globa. L. Timetable to Globa. When might all this happen? How many decades will be needed from the time of writing to the formation of a true global state? My own view is that it will happen this century, and perhaps even before mid-century. But on the question whether a mere half-century will be enough time is something I'm a lot less certain of. I don't see a global state being formed until the basic prerequisites for a global state are in place. That is, a truly 3D, virtually costless global communication system, the development of a global language that everyone speaks, at least as a second language, and perhaps even as their first language, replacing their former first language, and as a result of all this, the development of a homogeneous global culture. So how long will it take to set up the prerequisites? As mentioned frequently throughout this book, I don't think the planet will have an internet fast enough to show 3D images of lifelike quality until the speed is about 1 billion times greater than today's, that is, until about 2040. However, well before then, I do see an intellectual globus movement growing within the next 10 years. The very fact that people like me are reviving such ideas shows that these ideas are in the air. So if I'm having them, then so will others. There have been plenty of predecessors, see Chapter 1, Section E, for a history of the idea of a global state. Once globus interest groups and globus academics exist, they can then start pushing hard for the creation of a global language and declare to the planet that a global language is a necessary condition for the creation of a global state, and that a global state would bring huge benefits to the planet in terms of the riddance of war and the creation of planet-wide wealth and well-being. But, being honest, there will be costs as well. Only the most competitive ideas will survive the global competition, so those people whose egos are invested in the dying ideas will feel threatened. Globism is a two-edged sword ideology. Some of these negative consequences were discussed in Chapter 6. In the next decade, that is 2010 to 2020, ad-libbing, which is nearly almost over, I can imagine the creation of a world language that is an informal, perhaps even formal agreement, at least amongst the richest nations, that the world, and hence individual countries, should prepare for the creation of a global state as the major political goal of the 21st century. School children and adults need to be taught that the global state is coming, and so as to be able to participate in it, each person will need to be fluent in the world language. It's unlikely that artificial intelligence, AI, will be able to translate easily and well between human languages in the coming few decades. To be able to do that would require human-level artificial intelligence, the topic of my first book. Ad-libbing, actually, artificial intelligence-based translation programs, so long as the languages are not wildly different, for example, as between, say, Chinese and English, but say between European languages, they're not too bad. You more than get the gist. They're certainly better than not having them. Back to the book. A social pressure will grow that those people who cannot speak and read the world language will be severely handicapped. In time, they'll become economically handicapped because they will have difficulty getting a job. Not being able to speak and read the world language will become comparable to being illiterate today. So the creation of a world language and the creation of the globist ideology I see happening before 2020. I see another 10 years needed to create the technology for a true 3D global media, which ad-libbing we still don't have yet. But the bitrate, Brad keeps operating every year, so it's only a question of time. Back to the book. Then another 10-20 years for enough global cultural homogenization process to occur, given the global media. This takes us to mid-century, around 2050. By then, I'm assuming, the most important of the prerequisites will be in place, so that the globist parties can then push for the final establishment of a global state. The above has been mostly technologically based. Technology, I believe, is the fundamental driving force behind the creation of globism. Science and technology are the strongest sources of social and political change of our century, I believe. I see this trend only continuing, but what about political and economic trends? When might they play a role in the formation of a global state? One fairly safe approach to predicting the future is to extrapolate past trends, so long as one does not go too far into the future. For example, where qualitative change overtakes old quantitative change, such as when the automobile made irrelevant the predictions of the amount of horse dung lying on city streets. For example, in the case of the EU, it took 50 years to add 20 countries to its original list of members. Considering that there are now other economic blocs similar to the EU, I would not be at all surprised if in less than 10 to 20 years there will be a free trade area of the Americas, FTAA. I doubt very much that China will remain a dictatorship for more than 10 to 20 years if it continues its economic growth. Most of the eastern major cities of China by 2030 will have a standard of living comparable to that of today's US, with a US level of education and awareness of the world. Such a living standard will make it inevitable that China's population will insist on having its own democracy. Once that happens, the new China can help form an Asian Union or Eastern Union. The EU and the FTAA may very well decide to form an Atlantic Union within 10 years. Ideologically, they are already prepared. This Atlantic Union would initially be an economic union, but the civilizing influences and greater sophistication levels of the Europeans would civilize the American countries. The greater energy and creative dynamism of the Americans, from the US, would stimulate the more tradition-bound